Okay, that was weird. My camera just died in the middle of reading a chapter. So we'll start again with chapter 17, The Fledgling. The Gwyphant hung like a crumpled black rag, one wing upraised and the other folded awkwardly on its breast. No larger than a raven, it was young and barely out of its first molt. The head seemed a little too big for the rest of its body, the feathers thin and quilly. As Taryn cautiously approached, the Gwyphant fluttered vainly, unable to free itself. The bird opened its curved beak and hissed warningly, but its eyes were dull and half-closed. The companions had followed Taryn. As soon as Gurgi saw what it was, he hunched up his shoulders, and with many fearful glances behind him, turned and crept off a safe distance. Melangar whinnied nervously. The white pig, undisturbed, sat on her haunches and looked cheerful. Fluter, on seeing the bird, gave a low whistle. It's a stroke of luck the parents aren't about. Those creatures will tear a man to shreds if their young are in danger. It reminds me of Ashrin, Ellenway said, especially around the eyes on days when she had bad tempers. Dolly pulled an axe from his belt. What are you going to do? Taryn asked. The dwarf looked at him in surprise. Going to do? Do you have any other stupid questions? You can't imagine that I'd let it sit there, can you? I'm going to chop off its head to begin with. No, Taryn cried, seizing the dwarf's arm. It's badly hurt. Be glad of that, snapped Dolly. If it weren't, neither you nor I, nor any of us would be standing here. I will not have it killed, declared Taryn. It's in pain and it needs help. It's true, Ellenway said. It doesn't look comfortable at all. For the matter of that, it looks even worse than Ashrin. The dwarf threw his axe on the ground and put his hands on his hips. I can't make myself invisible, he snorted, but at least I'm no fool. Go ahead, pick up the little vicious thing. Give it a drink, pat its head, then you'll see what happens. As soon as it gets strength enough, the first thing it'll do is slice you to bits. The next thing, it flies straight to Iran. Then we'll be in a fine stew. What Dolly says is true, Fluter added. I myself don't enjoy chopping things up. The bird is interesting, in a disagreeable sort of way. But we've been lucky so far, with no trouble from the Gwyphants at least. I don't see the use of bringing one of Iran's spies right into our bosom, as you might say. A Flam is always kind-hearted, but this seems to be overdoing it. Medvin would not say so, Taryn answered. In the hills he spoke of kindness for all creatures. He told me much about the Gwyphants. I think it's important to bring this one to Cairdothel. No one has ever captured a live Gwyphant as far as I know. Who's to say what value it might have? The bard scratched his head. Well, yes, I suppose, if it had any use at all, it would be better alive than dead. But the proposition is risky, no matter what. Taryn gestured for the others to stand away from the bush. He saw the Gwyphant was wounded by more than the thorns. Perhaps an eagle had challenged it, for blood flecked its back, and a number of feathers had been torn out. He reached carefully. The Gwyphant hissed again, a long, rasping, rattled sound in his throat. Taryn feared the bird might be dying even then. He put a hand under its feverish body. The Gwyphant struck with beak and talons, but its strength had gone. Taryn lifted it free of the thorn bush. If I can find the right herbs, I'll make a poultice, Taryn told Ellenway. But I'll need hot water to steep them in. While the girl prepared a nest of grass and leaves, Taryn asked Gurgi to build a fire and heat some stones, which could be dropped into a cup of water. Then, Henwin at his heels, he set out quickly in search for the plants. How long are we going to stay here? Dolly shouted after him. Not that I care. You're the ones in a hurry, not I. He thrust his axe into his belt and jammed his cap tight on his head, furiously holding his breath. Taryn was again grateful for what Cole had taught him of herbs. He found most of what he needed growing nearby. Henwin joined the hunt with enthusiasm, grunting happily and rooting under leaves and stones. Indeed, the white pig was the first one to discover the important variety that Taryn had overlooked. The Gwyphant did not struggle when Taryn applied the poultice, soaking a piece of cloth torn from his jacket in another healing brew. He squeezed liquid drop by drop into the bird's beak. That's very well, said Dolly, whose curiosity had got the better of him, and had come to observe the operation. How do you imagine you'll carry the nasty thing? Perched on your shoulder? I don't know, Taryn said. I thought we could wrap it up in my cloak. Dolly snorted. That's the trouble with you great clodhoppers. You don't see beyond your noses. If you expect me to build a cage for you, you're mistaken. A cage would be just the thing, Taryn agreed. No, I wouldn't want to bother you with that. I'll try and make one myself. The dwarf watched contemptuously while Taryn gathered saplings and attempted to weave them together. Oh, stop it! Dolly finally burst out. I can't stand looking at botched work. Here, get out of the way. He shouldered Taryn aside and squatted on the ground and picked up the saplings, and he trimmed them expertly with his knife and lashed them into braided vines, and in no time at all the dwarf held up a serviceable cage. That's certainly more practical than making yourself invisible, Ellenway said, and the dwarf made no answer other than to look at her angrily. Taryn lined the bottom of the cage with leaves and gently put the Gwyphant inside. They resumed their march, and now Dolly led them at a faster pace to make up for the time that they had lost. He tramped steadily down the hill slopes, without even turning to see whether Taryn and the others were able to keep up with him. At the speed of their pace, Taryn realized, it served little purpose, since they were obliged to halt more frequently. But he did not deem it wise to mention this to the dwarf. Throughout the day the Gwyphant steadily improved. At each halt Taryn fed the bird and applied the medicines. Gergie was still too terrified to come near. Taryn alone handled the creature. When Fluter, endeavoring to make friends, put his finger into the cage, the Gwyphant roused and slashed at him with his beak. I warn you, snapped Dolly, no good will come of this. But don't pay attention to what I say. Go right ahead. Cut your own throats. Then come running and complaining afterwards. I'm just a guide. I do what I'm ordered, and that's all. At nightfall they made camp and discussed plans for the morrow. The Gwyphant had entirely recovered, and it had also developed an enormous appetite. It squawked furiously when Taryn did not bring food quickly enough, and it rattled its beak against the cage. It gobbled up the morsels that Taryn gave it, and then looked around for more. After eating, the Gwyphant crouched at the bottom of the cave. It cocked its head, and listening, its eyes followed every movement. Taryn finally ventured to put a finger past the bars and scratch the Gwyphant's head. The creature no longer hissed, and it made no attempt to bite him. The Gwyphant even allowed Ellenway to feed it, but the bard's attempt to make friends failed. It knows perfectly well It knows perfectly well I cannot speak. I don't know why. It knows perfectly well you'd have agreed to chop off its head, Ellenway told Fluter, so you can't blame the poor thing for being annoyed at you. If somebody wanted to chop off my head and then came around afterwards and wanted to be sociable, I'd peck at him too. Gwydion told me that the birds are trained when they're young, Taryn said. I wish he were here. He'd know how best to handle the creature. Perhaps it could be taught differently. But there's bound to be a good falconer at Cair Doffel. We'll see what he can do. But the next morning the cage was empty. Dolly, who had risen long before the others, was the first to discover it. The furious dwarf thrust the cage under Taryn's nose. The sapling bars had been slashed to pieces by the Gwyphant's beak. And there you have it, Dolly cried. I told you so. Don't say I didn't warn you. The treacherous creature is halfway to Anuvan by now, after listening to every word we said. If our Aun didn't know where we were, he will now. You've done well. Oh, very well, Dolly snorted. Spare me from fools and assistant pig-keepers. Taryn could not hide his disappointment or fear. Fluter said nothing, but the bard's face was grim. I've done the worst thing, as usual, Taryn said angrily. Dolly's right. There's no difference between a fool and an assistant pig-keeper. That's probably true, Ellenway said. Her remark did nothing to cheer up Taryn. But, she went on, I can't stand people who say I told you so. That's worse than somebody coming up and eating your dinner before you had a chance to sit down. Even so, she said, Dolly means well. He's not half as disagreeable as he pretends to be, and I'm sure he's worried about us. He's like a porcupine. prickly on the outside, but very ticklish once you turn him over. If he'd only stop trying to make himself invisible, I think it should do a lot to improve his disposition." There was no time for further regrets. Dolly set the men at an even swifter pace. They still followed the hills along the Estrade Valley, but by midday the dwarf had turned west, and once more they had begun descending up toward the plains. The sky had grown thick and gray as lead. Violent gusts of wind had whipped at their faces. The pale sun gave no warmth. Mellingar neighed uneasily. Henwin was placid and agreeable until now. Hedwin, placid and agreeable until now, began to roll her eyes and mutter to herself. The companions rested briefly, and Dolly went ahead to scout the land. In a short time he was back, and he led them to the crest of the hill. He motioned for them to stay close to the ground, and pointed toward the estrade below. The plain was covered with warriors, on foot and on horseback. Black banners snapped in the wind. Even at a distance, Taryn could hear the clank of weapons, the steady, heavy drumming of marching feet, and at the head of the winding columns rode the horned king. A giant figure towered above the men-at-arms, who galloped behind him. Curving antlers rose like eager claws, and as Taryn watched, terrified but unable to turn away, the horned king's head swung slowly in the direction of the heights. Taryn pressed flat against the earth. Aron's champion, he was sure, could not see him. It was only a trick of his mind, a mirror of his own fear, but it seemed the Horned King's eyes sought him out and thrust like daggers at his heart. "They have overtaken us," Taryn said in a flat voice. "Hurry," snapped the dwarf. "Get hustling instead of dawdling and moaning. We're no more than a day away from Cairdothel, and so are they. We can still move faster. If you hadn't stopped for that ungrateful spy of a Nuven, we'd be well ahead of them by now, and don't say I didn't warn you." "We should arm ourselves a little better," the bard said. "The Horned King will have outriders on both sides of the valley." Taryn unstrapped the weapons on Mellingar's back, and handed a bow and a quiver of arrows to his companions, as well as a short spear for each. King Edlig had given them a round of bronze bucklers, but they were dwarf-sized, and after his view of the marching hosts, Taryn found them pitifully small. Gurgi buckled a short sword around his waist, and of all the band he seemed the most excited. "Yes, yes," he cried. "Now bold, valiant Gurgi is a mighty warrior too. He has a grinding gasher and a pointed piercer. He is ready for great fightings and smitings." "So am I," Fuder declared. "Nothing withstands the onslaught of an angry bard." The dwarf clapped his hands to his head and gnashed his teeth. "Stop jabbering and move," he sputtered. This time he was too furious to hold his breath. Terence flung the buckler over his shoulder, and Henwin went back and grunted fearfully. "I know you're afraid," Taryn whispered coaxingly, "but you'll be safe in Cairdothel." The pig followed reluctantly, but as Dolly set off once again, she lagged behind, and it was all Taryn could do to urge her forward. Her pink snout trembled, and her eyes darted from one side of the path to the other. At the next halt, Dolly summoned Taryn. "Keep on like this," he cried, "and you'll have no chance at all. First Gwythaint delays, now a pig." "She's frightened," Taryn tried to explain to the angry dwarf. "She knows that the Horned King is near." "Then tie her up," Dolly said. "Put her on the horse." A few moments before, the pig had crouched at the roots of a tree. Now there was no sign of her. "Hen?" Taryn called, and he turned to the bard. "Where did he go? Where did she go?" He looked in alarm. The bard shook his head. Neither he nor Ellenway had seen her move. Gurgi had been watering Mellingar and had not noticed the pig at all. "She can't have run off again," Taryn cried, and he raced back into the woods. When he returned, his face was pale. "She's gone," he gasped. "She's hiding somewhere, I know it." He sank to the ground and put his head in his hands. "I shouldn't have let her out of my sight, not even for a moment," he said bitterly. "I have failed twice." "Let the others go on," Ellenway said. "We'll find her and catch up with them." Before Taryn could answer, he heard a sound that chilled his blood. From the hills came voices of a hunting pack, and in full cry, From the hills came the voices of a hunting pack in full cry, and the long notes of a horn. The companion stood frozen with dread. With the ice of terror at his throat, Taran looked at the silent faces around him, and the dire music trembled the air. A shadow flickered across the lower sky. "Where Gwyn and Hunter rides," murmured Fluter, "death rides close behind." And that is the end of chapter 17. Next time we'll read chapter 18, The Flame of Dernwyn, which is pretty exciting. You get to learn some cool things about the sword that Elenwe has. We're so near the end of the book. We have like 20 pages left. So I'm really excited that I get to share this with you. And I can't wait for you to finish it with me. Until I see you again, stay happy and stay safe. Goodbye, guys. I said goodbye, guys.